So welcome everyone. We're excited to feature Andy Molinsky, class of 90, and Steve Rochlin today, class of 90, to moderate this amazing session for our Global Alumni Career Initiative and discuss global dexterity. My name is Alexia Benros, and I'm the Career Network Coordinator for the Office of Alumni Relations on the Career and Life Design team. The Career and Life Design programs in the Brown Office of Alumni Relations is comprised of career and mentoring opportunities to build our Bermudian communities. The three pillars of career and life design include early engagement, experimental learning and engagement, and life after graduation. And life after graduation is what we're going to be talking about through this whole series. We're really excited to have you join us, that through workshops and one-on-one coaching and innovative resources, we want to empower our alumni community to design their lives by building valuable networks and making connections with employers to alumni, alumni to alumni, to stay current with a diverse array of possibilities, fostering a sense of purpose and direction. And today, we're so excited. Andy Molinsky, class of 90, will discuss his recent book, Global Dexterity, which offers the tools needed to simultaneously adapt behavior to new cultural contexts while staying authentic and grounded in your own natural style. Based on more than a decade of research and training and consulting with managers, executives around the world, this book reveals an approach to adapting while feeling comfortable, an essential skill that enables you to switch behaviors and overcome the emotional and physiological challenges of doing so. We're so thrilled to have this session as part of our Global Alumni Career Initiative. Andy Molinsky is a professor at Brandeis University International Business School with a joint appointment in the Department of Psychology. Andy received his PhD in organizational behavior and his master's in psychology from Harvard University. He also holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University and a bachelor's in international affairs from Brown University. Andy's work helps people develop the insight and courage necessary to act outside their personal and cultural comfort zones when doing important but challenging tasks in work and life. His research and writing have been featured in the Harvard Business Review magazine, Psychology Today, the Financial Times, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Boston Globe, NPR, and Voice of America. Andy was awarded as a top voice for LinkedIn for his work in education, and his first book, Global Dexterity, received the Axiom Award for Best Business Book in International Business and Globalization, as has been used widely in organizations around the world. We are so excited to have Steve Rochlin, class of 90, and also a friend of Andy's from their time at Brown. We're so excited to have Steve moderating today. Steve is founder and CEO of Impact ROI. Impact ROI helps organizations achieve superior social, environmental, and financial performance through research and management consulting. Impact ROI assesses the value of sustainability and ESG and enables their clients to design high impact strategies that support people, planet, and profit. As the lead author of the acclaimed Project ROI research series, Steve has developed the pathway for companies to deliver sustainable and collaborative impact that is also profitable. Steve has over 25 years of experience in sustainability, ESG, corporate responsibility, and DEI, and social impact. He has advised leading companies across a wide variety of industry sectors on how to improve sustainability performance in a way that drives competitive success. Steve is also co-author of 2 books, Beyond Good Company, Next Generation Corporate Citizenship, and Untapped, Creating Value in Undeserved Markets. He is a senior fellow for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Corporate Citizenship Center. He is also a senior fellow in social innovation for Babson College. Steve obtained his master's of public policy from Harvard University and his undergrad at Brown, his bachelor's at Brown University as well. We are so excited to welcome you both. And Andy and Steve, I will turn things over. We're so excited to hear from you both and hear more about global dexterity in this fireside chat. Oh, Steve, I think that you're muted right now.
And I've already lost Facebook bingo, so I apologize for that. But Alexia, thank you so much. I'm Steve Rochlin, class of 1990, ever true to Brown, and coming to you from the swamp of Washington, D.C., where it's kind of miserable, but still a great place to be. Alexia, Johanna, Crystal, everyone at the Brown Global Alumni Center, thank you so much for the privilege of joining you here today. This is really a great experience and a little bit surreal for me to be moderating this session with my good friend Andy. We'll give you a little bit more background on the relationship and our experience of Brown and how this has sort of led and influenced Andy's work over the years. But first, just to remind, if you're just joining us, please, in the chat, share your name, your location, and your graduation year, where you're from and where you're based. That would be a lot of fun. A lot of you are already doing it, so we appreciate it. Let me just give you a little bit of background. One of the things that Alexia and the good folks at the Alumni Center asked us to do is just sort of start a little bit with our own experience at Brown, which was, for so many of us, such a seminal and transformative experience in so many positive ways. And so Annie and I got to know each other, I think, just a few weeks into freshman year. We've become great friends. We're housemates for sophomore, junior, and senior year. We've always kept up with each other, always celebrated successes, been interested in our careers. But I don't think we imagined that we'd be in a situation like this, and we'll do our best to keep things professional in this discussion. I'll mention that myself, I was a major in political science. And I would also say, and be very curious, Andy, in a second, I noticed that our merry band of folks, some of whom may be watching right now, we always had sort of an ethos in our group that we didn't want to stay insular. We wanted to meet and get to know as many different types of folks at the university to sort of have the enriching experience. We were sort of being inclusive without knowing that we were being inclusive. If you looked at our social gatherings, you would find a sort of hodgepodge of folks from around the world, a hodgepodge of folks with all kinds of different backgrounds, whether it was related to their race, ethnicity, whether it was related to their geography in the United States, outside the United States, whether it was related to the kinds of interests that they had, whether they were from the theater crowd, the athletic crowd, the Greek system, whether it was they were living at French house or any kind of place like that. And I wonder if that sort of ethos has sort of influenced some of your interest in cross-cultural communications. One of the things that I'll say about Andy is that Andy, along with being super smart, and that being obvious when he was at Brown, was also someone who had an incredible facility with language, a great interest in international relations, and someone who was also just a charming son of a gun. So I'm wondering if that had influence over you and your interests and the path that you chose to take. So Andy, let me sort of pass the baton to you and sort of tell us a little bit about your experience at Brown and how it sort of shaped your interests and your career.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody. Glad to see so many people joining our conversation today. Please chat in any questions, comments. I've already seen some from our friends that I won't repeat. I think to be honest, Brown for me was an amazing experience. Certainly personally, certainly socially. Academically, I don't know if I really came into my own there. I kind of was poking around areas that I was interested in, but I didn't quite know what I was interested in. So I majored in international relations at Brown. To be perfectly honest, it was because it was like the only major that I could possibly imagine doing, and it was like this catch-all major that I could basically like. It was a major where I didn't really have to commit to anything. I was always interested in languages. I studied Russian at Brown when I first got there with the intention of going to Russia to study abroad. Of course, there was no internet back then. And I don't know how I found out. I must have like gone to the abroad office like right before I was hoping to go to Russia. And they told me I didn't have enough Russian. So yeah, that was a problem. This was before the wall came down. So it was a little harder to study there. And now, of course, it's gone full circle. It's probably wouldn't be a top choice to study either. I pivoted. I took Spanish 101 for 1 year. I'd never taken Spanish before and went to Spain to study instead. And that's, I think, where I really started to be interested in this sort of idea of cross-cultural communication. It was, yeah, to sort of peg our generation. This was all pre-internet. We had no, you couldn't just sort of Google map something. You couldn't just watch on YouTube a different country or culture. You had to like go to encyclopedias or something. Like we were like, this is like really old school. I didn't have any sense of what it was like to be in a different culture. I grew up in a monocultural environment. Both my parents are from the US. But I was really fascinated and interested in this stuff. And when I got to Spain, it just blew my mind. Like just the simple fact that there was like this different world of people speaking this different language with these different rules, sort of like, I don't know, some of the similar sort of social norms, but some different social norms. And at some sort of basic level, it really just fascinated me. I came back to Brown, didn't know what I wanted to do after graduation, honestly. Applied to a bunch of different jobs, probably like you did, Steve. And like in that era, I guess, was it like an economic downturn, I think, around then? Yeah.
Was.
Yeah. So I got like a ton of rejections from random jobs because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I decided I'd go to school again because I like school. I like learning. I went to Columbia University, the School of International Affairs, because I was interested again in international stuff, but didn't quite know what. I decided to study international business mostly because I figured that would be, I don't know, a reasonable thing to study. Neither of my parents or I didn't have any role models in the business world or anything like that. So it was really honestly quite random. I had never taken a business class in my life before. I started studying it and I quickly realized that if I'm going to do this, I felt sort of like a poser. Like I've never done anything in international business. Why am I studying international business? This doesn't make any sense. So I took a leave of absence. I left, and I went to Paris and I tried out international business again to sort of like pick up on a theme. I didn't know any French, so I learned French. I mean, as much as I could, and then I went there, sort of jumped in, and I got a job. And the job wasn't interesting. It didn't sort of pique my interest in being an international business person. However, here's what happened. I was in the office, and this was sort of in the era, just to peg us, of the boxy little Mac computers. So I had one of those in the office. Like you probably remember those. In fact, I see Adam, my roommate from freshman year, is on the call here, and I think his was the first Mac computer I had ever seen. That little boxy Mac, I forget what, SE maybe, I don't know. Anyways, so I did my work in my job, which was like super boring. However, I did my work really quickly. And then I would have like all this time to pretend I was doing work. But what I was really doing was taking notes on what was happening in the office, like my little random, anthropological notes. Like I mean, I was just sort of noticing things and I thought it was really cool. And it really excited me, this idea of like people switching languages and switching cultural behaviors and interacting across cultures and doing business across cultures and pretending they understood when they didn't. All these sort of like little mini dynamics of cross-cultural communication. Nothing I ever studied. But I was just interested in it. I came back. Luckily, I had another year at Columbia to finish. And Columbia is like Brown. It's actually a bigger university than Brown. They've got more graduate schools. And I sort of poked around and I asked all these people and tried to figure out, like, put a name to what I was interested in. And it turned out it was called social psychology and organizational behavior. And from there, I just sort of took off. I decided, I mean, that's another story. I decided to get a PhD. Could tell the story if someone's interested. And ever since, I've been a professor, and I've been really fascinated by not just cultural differences, but this idea that people can adapt and adjust their behavior across cultures. And so that's what global dexterity is essentially. And yeah, that maybe brings us to our topic today.
Absolutely. And so if I can just sort of add some color with my own experience, when we were living together, I would say that it was probably a competition in our house to be voted least likely to ever go overseas, either myself or our housemate Keith. And so the journey that I've been on, which has taken me ultimately over to 90 countries, is very unexpected, to say the least. And so in doing that, I remember one of the first times sort of working in this field of environment, social governance, sustainability, that's become a passion and vocation, certainly demands being able to deal with a whole variety of different kinds of cultures, and to build common understanding. And I remember going to Japan and being very anxious about it and trying to say, what are the cultural differences that I need to be sensitive to? And of all the resources that I looked at, the biggest takeaway that I had was to be very polite about how I handed my business card. Make sure to do it with two hands, which, hey, was a great tip, but not exactly the kinds of depth and content that I was looking for. Didn't have a lot of help, and didn't find the resources that were out there, the books that were out there, to be useful, practical, make common sense. And so I think what you've been able to do in your career, Andy, particularly on the way you focused on cross-cultural communication, has been so important, so valuable, because you've been able to provide things that make sense, that are useful, that are practical, that are applicable. And so give us a little bit more of the origin story about why you decided to write not just the book Global Dexterity, but your more recent book as well. It sort of continues that journey, Forging Bonds.
Yeah, sure. So when I was doing my PhD in organizational behavior and psychology, I wanted to focus on culture because I wanted to try to understand and make sense of what I had experienced in France and Spain and so on, and other travels too. And so I was fascinated by this idea that it wasn't just the idea of understanding cultural differences, which, by the way, the field, if and I know people on this call aren't experts in the field of culture or anything like that, but but if you sort of even dip your toe into the world of culture and business and psychology, even those worlds are obsessed with cultural differences, like how the French are different from the Japanese, and how Argentinians are different from Americans. There's a famous book of sort of a pop book called Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands, which has to do with rituals. And then there are other books that have to do with culture differences and cultural values across cultures. But the theme is about differences, right? And if in sort of the implicit idea is if you can understand those differences, you're good. But what I started to understand, and by the way, while I was doing my PhD, I was volunteering at a resettlement agency in Boston, working at that time with Russian immigrants, learning to adapt and adjust their behavior to the US, especially in the job context, like learning how to make small talk, how to interview, how to promote themselves. When, by the way, all those things are like super hard for them. Because they were different in where they came from. But the big epiphany that I had at the time was that, and maybe it doesn't sound like an epiphany, but to me it was like, you know what? If they can understand these differences, that's actually not going to help them. That's not the problem they have. Like, the problem they have is not articulating the differences. The problem they have is adapting and adjusting their behavior in light of these differences. And in fact, it's not just that, it's how they can adapt and adjust their behavior in light of these differences without losing their sense of authenticity, like being able to do it. Because like, you can sort of kind of suck it up, you can sort of suppress who you are, in the very short term. But if you that's it's sort of not like a very palatable way to go through life, or certainly to go through work. And for single situations, yes, maybe, but over time it doesn't have a lot of staying power. So how can people learn to adapt and adjust their behavior across cultures, cope with the psychological challenges of doing that, like feeling inauthentic, feeling incompetent, feeling embarrassed, feeling a sense of loss of face for some people, whatever it might be, like what's kind of going on in your head? How can you cope with all that stuff and simultaneously feel like authentic enough? And to me, that was like a real meaty problem and very different than what other people were talking about. And so that's basically that's what the book Global Dexterity is about, which, by the way, came out about 10 years ago. So it's new in the scheme of the world, I suppose, but it's not new. I do have a new book that came out like 2 months, 3 months ago, something like that, which is about building relationships across cultures. And so we talked about that, and that so global dexterity is focused on an individual person learning to adapt and adjust their behavior without losing themselves in the process. The newest book it's called Forging Bonds in a Global Workforce. That's about building relationships. That's more interpersonal.
All right. So you also have another book, Reach, which is about
Yep.
getting outside your comfort zone. And I think, they, even though that's not explicitly about cross-cultural relationships, I think it has a real impact in terms of
Yeah.
thinking about where you are in your comfort zone, dealing with the anxiety and making bold moves. Tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so that book basically emerged from when so I did Global Dexterity. Global Dexterity is essentially about stepping outside your cultural comfort zone. That's basically what the book's about, stepping outside your cultural comfort zone. And I got a lot of emails and sort of comments from people saying, "Hey, Global Dexterity is really cool, but have you ever thought of writing a book just about stepping outside your comfort zone, period? Like, forget about culture." Like, and so that I got enough of those questions and comments that I was like, "Hey, yeah, why not? That's kind of cool." And so I like looked and it was a tough book to write because I didn't want it to be like all the books I write are like trying to be like super practical and useful, but they have to be kind of like have some sort of intellectual backbone to them. They can't be like pure pop psychology books. So I felt that was a tough book to write just because of the topic, like get outside your comfort zone, right? So but that's what the book's about. And for that book I interviewed over 100 people in a variety of different professions, like totally different professions, everything from doctors to police officers to rabbis, priests, academics, consultants, whatever, trying to understand why it was hard, sort of what held people back, why it's hard to step outside your comfort zone, what you can learn across professions, how people avoid doing it, what people's best sort of like best in quotation mark strategies are, and then most importantly, what they can do to be successful in a way that's practical, that's like usable for people. So that's what that book was about. It was sort of like a riff on global dexterity, but not just about culture.
All right, so let's dive in a little bit to some of the content here. If we focus on the latest book, Forging Bonds, you have this framework, which is really cool and useful. It's the 6 Ps of building relationships. Share a little bit about what that's about.
Yeah, so anyone who's read a business book knows that one requirement is to have everything start with the same letter. So of course we had to do that too. Just kidding. Yeah. I mean, kidding, not kidding, I guess. Yeah. So the 6 Ps basically for that, for all the books I do, I always do like interviews with like tons of people to try to like have some, have to make sure that I'm sort of capturing the wisdom out there, the wisdom of the masses in a sense. And so what I do is I try to infer from these interviews what I see in terms of patterns. And I should mention that book, that third book is not a solo authored book. That's with a colleague of mine, non-Brown alum, Melissa Hahn. I know, seriously. Yeah. I went outside my comfort zone for that one. Um, yeah. So 6 Ps, basically those are it's sort of the idea that people living in being socialized in a particular culture um, uh, tend to have some sort of implicit rules or understanding about how relationships are formed, what the sort of rules of the game are, in a sense. But those rules of the game can be very different across cultures. And so the 6 Ps represent those different dimensions, those different sort of implicit ways that relationships, that people understand relationships formation, let's say. By the way, I do understand, of course, that people are not always sort of monocultural. People can have been influenced by multiple cultural, influences, not even just national culture, but we can get to that if we want. But so the 6 Ps. So the 6 Ps are place, power, uh, purpose, privacy, presence, and pacing. So just to give you a sense, place, the idea relationship building happens in different places in different national and organizational cultures. So for example, just a little example in Japan, relationship building, especially with the superior at work, is often restricted to events outside the workplace, outside everyday work, like a visit to a karaoke bar at night or something like that. And that would be a context, like place becomes very important because the social norms and social rules can be bent, like they're more elastic when you go into this different place in this different context in this different time. Whereas, in the US or Canada or something, you can chat with your boss in the elevator, at the water cooler, wherever, right? At lunch, it's not as big a deal. So that would be an example of place, one little example. Privacy. I remember one of our Brazilian interviewees said that, there's almost no topic she wouldn't discuss with her workmates. Like it's like, what's the big deal? We're just people. Whereas when I talked to a Taiwanese manager about sort of, I don't know, small talk, which is a whole subsection of the book, I remember that manager was saying, like, they keep asking me these questions about myself and my family. It's like, slow down. I just met you. Let's talk about something less personal first. So that would be that's like a good example of like privacy. And so you go on and on with these different aspects of culture, but I think it's kind of cool to sort of understand what your implicit 6Ps are yourself, because by the way, they might not be characteristic of your own culture that you come from, right? You might have your own style, but it was sort of a way to ground the notion of relationship building across cultures in sort of these concrete ideas.
I remember early in my career, I was traveling to Germany, and in Germany there was a management book that was a bestseller that translated pretty directly. The book was called "No Fun at Work," and it was all about making sure that you didn't get to know your colleagues, just did the job and went home. Um, uh, and this leads me to something that is sort of something that you cover a lot in your books, and may show up in Reach, the about the comfort zone as well. And that is that there's I guess on one level, very surprising, on another level, maybe not, the amount of anxiety that's created from small talk, and particularly the art and the politics of small talk in the workplace. It's almost seems like it gets to the level of a phobia for some people. And you argue in your books that small talk is almost sort of quasi-universal in global business, and that it's got value and purpose and importance. Tell us a little bit about this. What advice do you have for successfully making small talk across cultures? So many howl in despair at the idea of making small talk. What do we do about it?
Yeah, small talk was something that people had a lot of different opinions about, and when I say quasi universal, I mean that you know in global business, you often find people who are quite cosmopolitan. They might have gone to Brown, but they might be from Pakistan, but they might have worked in Switzerland. You know what I mean? So like they're sort of collecting different cultural identities and norms and so on, and so they're more cosmopolitan. In these global business circles, small talk does sort of seem to play a role, whereas people who are locals, pure locals, really having very little international experience, you might see the national cultural norms have more influence. Like in Germany, for instance, right? Small talk is not as big a deal in Germany, though you can certainly find Germans who will talk your ear off. I work with a German colleague, and she loves small talk. But then again, now that I think about it, she studied in England and the US. So maybe she picked that up. And maybe that was, maybe, you can also have a personality and a set of preferences that are different from your own national culture, right? And then you sort of find yourself in a new culture, and you sort of like the chains are off and you're like, oh, I can do this. This is cool. But yeah, in terms of tips for making small talk, we wrote an article in Harvard Business Review recently about this. Um, uh, you know, I think one of the biggest things, and this sort of like this is probably obvious, but still worth saying, and it's sort of a contrast to the point about the cultural differences point. When you think about culture, you're always like primed to think about differences, but small talk is not about differences. Like small talk, I mean, it could be differences, but in the spirit of trying to find connections, right? You're trying to find similarities, connections, create that human moment. I remember so well one one example of this for me was I was doing an executive education program for a Korean company. It was in Boston, and I had done the morning session, and it was about maybe 25 sort of young-ish professionals, maybe in their early 30s, something like that, from a very large Korean company, and we were having lunch. It was a day of exec ed, and so it was a lunchtime period. And so I was the only one who didn't know anyone really, and so I got my food and I was looking to see where I could sit, and there were a bunch of tables of people all sort of chatting and so on. Then there's this one table with this guy with lying on the table, like literally, like his head was on the table, and he was asleep, or he looked like he was asleep. And like I was like, that seems like a good table to check out. And so I go over there, and the guy like sees me, so he's only like half asleep. And he sees me, and he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." And I said some joke about like how I guess my session wasn't really that interesting after all, or something like that. And the guy's like, "No, no, 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 that's not it. I turns out that I have two small kids, ages 1 and 3, and back home in Seoul, and I can't get any sleep ever. And like this is the only time on these trips that I can get sleep." And what was funny is that, so I started that small talk conversation. And when you start an opening conversation, especially with an open-ended question, right? I asked him an open-ended, sort of like, it was a joke, but it was like an open-ended question. It invited him to share something. I didn't say like, some question like, did you get your food or something like that, which would be yes or no. I asked him an open-ended question, and what was great about that is that it opened the door for him to share, if he wanted to, some information, which he did, because he was embarrassed. But what was cool was that I too, at that time, had two little kids, and I too, strangely enough, had trouble sleeping. And like I totally got it. I totally got what he was talking about. And so we had this whole conversation about little kids and being a working, dad and all this stuff. And it was like this great moment where we completely transcended cultural boundaries. I didn't have this is like an engineer from some Korean company. On the face of it, I didn't really have anything in common with him, but we discovered something in common. And, if we had kept talking, we might have discovered other things in common, or maybe shared similar experiences, or maybe, I don't know, if he lived here, maybe we get together for coffee and then we sort of build a set of connections and so on. So my point is that small talk's the gateway, right? And so I think that that's why it can play such an important role.
Uh, so let's sort of keep on this theme and talk about that moment when we're meeting someone new. And the old cliche says, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And one of the things that you find and that you say in the books is that misreading each other's signals can really derail our attempts at making a positive first impression, almost sort of engender this sort of sense of uncomfortable situation and chaos at work. Why is this relationship stage, that sort of first impression stage, so tricky across cultures, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, it's like a vicious circle. Um, in all this, I think all this happens like unconsciously. So if you've ever read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, in that book he talks about research that actually was research that I was involved in at Harvard during my PhD by Nalini Ambati, about what she calls thin slices of behavior. The idea that thin slices, like short slices of behavior, and basically the idea is it's sort of a scientific validation of this first impression idea, that in fact really fast impressions that become very sticky. And so that's what the research talks about in social psychology, and obviously that would be true in these cases as well. And I think cross-cultural communication is rife for misinterpretation that sort of becomes self-fulfilling. And that's part of the problem. So it's almost like they act in a confusing or unexpected way. Like maybe they don't show as much positive emotion as you're used to. Maybe you come from a culture where another P, by the way, the 6 Ps, we'll call it presence, like the way that you show yourself in those initial moments of building a relationship. In some cultures, that's meant to be sort of a pot, like in the US. I think in the US, there is a norm to be sort of positive and friendly and upbeat and smile, right? Like that, there is this norm. And of course, there's variation by personality and so on. But, generally speaking, I think there's this sort of positive affect. But what if you come from a culture where that's simply not the norm? And it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that the person doesn't like you or doesn't want to be, connected to you or anything. It doesn't mean any of that. It's just a different style. But let's say you don't know that. And let's say you very quickly say, they don't show as much positive emotion as I'm used to. They don't like me. Or maybe like they're weird. Like that happens like really fast. And then you start to feel anxious, and then you start to avoid them, or you start to want to get out of the conversation, or you're less motivated to be in the conversation. And you can see how that like becomes like this super quick little spiral, and it can sort of derail potential opportunities before they even happen. So that's what I would say in terms of that. Steve, I'm noticing there might be some questions. I don't know whether we want to. We've got about 20 minutes. Do we want to keep? We could probably keep talking forever. But should we look in the chat here? Or?
Yeah, let's look at the chat. Let me encourage everyone who is online to either, if you've got questions, comments, observations, experiences, share them in the chat. We'll try and get to them, and actually we'll open up the audio for people who want to contribute the old-fashioned way and just speak your question in a couple of minutes. I see that we've got one from Keith, class of 1990. Who is asking if someone is contemplating an expat assignment or even a week-long trip, what should be top of mind for trips that might otherwise, tips that might otherwise not be on the sort of typical list in order to thrive and avoid pitfalls?
Well, I mean, you should answer this too. You take a lot of those trips. Those are two separate questions. So the question about like the trips. Um, so short-term business trips. I think it's very tempting to to sort of fit it into your busy schedule, right? You arrive, let's say like the meeting starts on a, Monday morning, so you arrive late Sunday night or early, I mean, maybe early Monday morning or whatever it might be. What if you instead, if you had the leeway, what if you sort of built in a little bit of a buffer? And especially if this is a foreign trip, and especially if it's farther away, and especially if you have the leeway, what if you built in a little bit of a buffer to have an extra day or so? And what if you asked the person who you were going to meet with about some tips about like cool restaurants or places to visit or something? And let's say you did a few of those or something like that, where you're starting to actually show interest in their culture, interest in their city. People have a lot of pride in their culture, not everyone, but oftentimes you'll find people have pride in their cities and cultures. And what if you did that? And think about like the small talk in the bonding that happens the next day, right? How it's much less superficial because it's actually built on something that's real, and it's something that you have that maybe the person has even suggested, and maybe that person has had a similar experience at that place. And so that's like a little tip, I think, that can actually have a substantive upside. That's not the question about a expat assignment, but that's on the short term angle. But you, Steve, you have way more experience with short term business trips than I do. So what's your go-to?
I'll give a quick example, and one of the things that I think sort of shows up in your work, Andy, which is so incredibly helpful, which is not just understanding the culture that you're going to, but also understanding the culture and assumptions that you're bringing with yourself. And in a particular trip to Japan, very high stakes, sort of bidding on a very, very big project with a lot of different, well-known global organizations that were competing for the work. One of the things, understanding that as an American, one of the things that happened is that we're known for being, let's say we're known for being confident and for not being afraid to express that confidence. And in that type of situation, going into a culture where it's very important in many businesses to express humility, one of the things that those who were bidding on this work were being subtly tested on, I would learn later, was whether or not we were going to be too arrogant as Americans and the other Europeans who were bidding and wouldn't be willing to sort of adapt ourselves to the local culture. And so during presentations, one of the things that they would do to everyone in the speakers would say, "Oh my God, we are so humbled and thrilled to have an emissary such as you, an eminence such as you, here to present and teach us. We know nothing. We are here to learn from everything you would say." And what I would learn later is that the other Americans in particular who would hear this would kind of get a big smile and say, "Thanks." and then say, let me share with you everything I know and all my deep expertise. And you know, in part because of conversations that you and I had had, and the type of work that you do, I sort of took a different angle on this. And when I went there and heard something like this, I was primed, I was ready, and understood I was about to fall into a stereotypical trap about what they expected of me. And started my presentation differently and said, actually, I know nothing. I said, I've learned some things. Hopefully, there's some things that will be useful that I can share with you. But really, I am as here to learn from as much from you as you're able to learn from me. And just that little introduction and shift set our team apart, and actually said, these are folks that we can work with. So that, I think, is a successful. I unfortunately have probably more examples of unsuccessful examples, but things that I think really start to come out of your work, which is incredibly valuable. We have another question from Muhammad, class of 1990. Class of 1990 is representing. That is fantastic. And he asks, have you studied the situation of people who are in a perpetual state of cultural adaptation and exchange, and how it actually starts to change you as a person at a fundamental and foundational level?
No, I have not. But, I think that I think that's really, interesting. And I think there are a lot of people, so I'm a professor now, so I've stayed in the world of academics, and I come across a lot of people like that, actually. So, I don't, I haven't studied people like that, but I think it is an interesting question, like they're, you know, I think what's really, really,
Who, let me
what's
just sort
that?
of jump in. Are there people, you talk a lot about code switching, and there are people who are able to sort of exercise that muscle and become really good at it.
Yeah, I mean, what I was thinking more was, yes, true that people can code switch and maybe people can collect a variety of different styles that, maybe the more places you go, the more styles that you can sort of maybe develop, and then even develop authentic versions of those styles that sort of like are different ways of being you. So it's not that it's superficial, but that you've got a variety, you've got a wider range, let's say. But I was also thinking, when in terms of that question, is that it's not always just the amount of cultures, the amount of travel that you do. I think it's an interaction between that and the extent to which you're self-reflective about it. Like, I mean, you could have people, you could have someone, traveling to gazillion different countries and just never really being self-reflective and never being thoughtful about much of any of this. And you could have someone else, having far little like actual practical experience, but being super self-reflective and thoughtful about it. And so I think that that's really an important part of it as well. I think when you are crossing cultures, you can discover, when you are self-reflective, a lot of different things. You can discover different ways. You can sort of like question and put into context the way that your culture is. Like, it's sort of like the fish in water that doesn't understand that they're in water until they're not in water. I mean, you can start to develop some really interesting perspectives on your own culture, and then you can also develop some interesting perspectives on yourself. Maybe they're latent aspects of yourself, like maybe you didn't realize it, but that in your own culture you had sort of you had a way of being compliant with the norms, but that when those norms are loosened and there's a way of acting in a new culture that's different, you realize, whoa, I actually like this better. Like, I see this actually in the classroom, in the MBA classroom. You'll get students from East Asian cultures where the sort of style of, not every single classroom in East Asia, I mean, it's obviously many different countries, but there is sort of a broadly speaking, a norm where you're sort of a dutiful student and you're not sort of necessarily individualistically raising your hand and making a comment. Sort of, it's not like the Brown seminar style where you're debating and discussing and even contradicting the professor. It's much more top down, let's say, broadly speaking. um I have students who come here, I certainly have students who come here feeling very uncomfortable about the US style and have a difficult time adapting. But I also have students who are like, whoa, like it's like they're unleashed. And they're like, I never realized this, but I actually really like, speaking up in class and debating and even sort of, contradicting my professor, or I even like this new style. So you can start to, you know, peel back the onion of culture and start to discover who you are when you put yourself in these different contexts where these rules don't apply. So I think that's kind of interesting too.
We have another question from Jan Lee, who is asking, starting a new role at a global NGO. Congratulations. And asks what your advice is for achieving consensus across international offices to achieve solutions that could work globally.
Wow. That is a big question. I honestly don't have a great answer for it. I mean that starts to bring in a lot of different factors in terms of, for one thing, company culture, right? So we've been talking a lot about national culture, but how about company culture and or organizational culture and so on? And achieving consensus among a lot of different subgroups around the world is I don't know. I could sort of give a quick answer, but if you want to chat, hit me up, text me, contact me on LinkedIn or email. I'll be happy to chat with you about it. But I think that's probably a longer conversation.
Fantastic. Next question is from Jimmy W. from also class of 1990. All right.
Wow.
Who writes, as a considered minority here in America, I've been code switching my entire life. In fact, it's simultaneously a survival mechanism and an upward mobility must. And thank you for the great comment there, Jimmy. Completely resonate with that and observe it. Any reactions to that, Andy?
Um, no, except that I think I imagine that's completely true. There's I've created a certification course, a training course outside of my university, just sort of a private, sort of my little side hustle kind of thing, based on global dexterity, where I train teachers and consultants and coaches and managers how to use global dexterity in their work. And I have two colleagues who work with me in this. And we recently had a guy from Los Angeles who took our course, and he does exactly that. He helps folks in Los Angeles um, to learn to code switch, young Black professionals, let's say, to learn to code switch, and was particularly interested in the idea of global dexterity because even though global dexterity isn't really particularly about that context, it's more sort of an internationally focused idea. A lot of the ideas around inauthenticity and authenticity and trying to find ways of adapting without without losing yourself in the process. All those sort of those dynamics he sort of resonated with him, and so he took our course to try to integrate some of what we talk about in the international stage into the work that he does. So that's a it's not really a it's sort of I see what you're saying, and so I think global dexterity can resonate. Yeah.
So Crystal, class of 26, and that's not 1926, that's 2026. So current student. Uh,
1826. Yes.
how can I, as a current international relations student planning to work in various countries, effectively engage in or recreate the impact of meaningful small talk despite not being fluent in the local language?
I think I think that when you're communicating across cultures, despite being fluent, I mean, you're sort of like you're sending a message. So there's like the message that you send, and then there's like the meta message, right? Like what in the meta message would be the idea that people see that you're trying, people see that you're respectful, people see that you're curious, people see that you're interested. Those are meta messages, right? Those are sort of impressions that you give beyond the literal words that you make. And I think you can do all that stuff without being like perfectly natively fluent in a language, right? And I think that works very well across cultures. So that's what I would encourage you to do.
Another question from Jewel, and starts off by saying that Jewel teaches ESG, CSR, and sustainable development. Jewel, you are speaking my language. That's fantastic. Need to learn more about what you're doing. So Joel teaches to Indian and mid-senior senior professionals, recently tried to calm a student's nerves by suggesting some movies to watch instead of working on an executive summary. And while other students found it relaxing and even humorous, student got offended and said she wanted to learn deep techniques in a short span of time and said she was disappointed. And Jewel wonders, how could I have handled it better?
Mm. I don't know. I think I'd have to hear more about that. I think that would be more in the that would be in the realm of like a longer conversation. So, it, I feel bad not providing a quick, smart, useful response, but I don't have one. So
But doesn't it go
maybe
back?
you do.
Doesn't it go back a little bit to what you were talking about earlier, that a lot of there's sort of an obsession about saying that we have to avoid all costs in these types of situations, creating offense, but actually, that's not necessarily the objective, that there's learning that can happen in that context and situation. Um, uh, is there sort of some additional nuance that you might want to talk about related to that?
I guess so. I mean, I'm looking at the question here. Suggesting some movies to watch instead of working an executive summary. Some people found it humorous. I mean, so whenever you suggest something to a group, you're always going to have natural variability in how much people want that. That's just inevitable, right? You're going to get a range of different preferences and responses. One student got offended. I mean, you can certainly acknowledge that they got offended, and they're in that she was disappointed, and maybe you could understand more about that. Maybe you could find a way to accommodate that person's needs as well, if that's your role. I mean, I don't know. That's what I'm saying. It's a longer conversation about, this, yeah, it's more of like almost like a teaching strategy, philosophy, group management question, which is a fair question, but I feel it's a longer conversation.
Um, uh, Irene wants us to come back to the discussion of small talk and asks any advice for a person who came from a culture with no small talk and where small talk is considered almost inappropriate or rude.
Yeah. That is a great question. I teach an MBA class. I'm not suggesting you take my class, but I'm just giving you some context. I teach an MBA class here at Brandeis, where about global dexterity, where students as part of the class, need to choose a situation that's outside their cultural comfort zone. And during the semester, they have to actually work on doing it in real situations and keep a diary and so on, and integrate some of the tools that I teach into those situations. And small talk is one of the most popular ones. So I have a lot of students who come from cultures where small talk isn't that common, and then in the US they find themselves, especially in professional context, needing to learn to do it. I mean, I think there's for any behavior, there are two different things that you need to focus on. You need to focus on ability, and you need to focus on motivation, right? So it sounds like you're motivated. It sounds like you want to, right? That's one key thing, because some people don't. Some people feel resentful and annoyed that they have to do it in the first place, and they kind of avoid doing it. It's good that you're motivated, that you want to try to learn. And then in terms of ability, I think that, I mean, so I have some concrete suggestions. I wrote a book, this book on forging bonds in the global workforce. You could check that book out. I wrote an article in Harvard Business Review very recently about making small talk across cultures. That's publicly available. So there are, and a lot of people have talked about small talk, so not just me. So there's a lot of tips and tools around that. But I think the most important thing would be the idea that, for any one of these behaviors, when you're adapting across cultures or learning something new across cultures, I think it's really important to realize that you're not, metaphorically speaking, you're not trying to hit the bullseye of an archery target, in a sense that there's not one, like, you don't have to just like, nail it. Like there's one exact way to do small talk. I think people oftentimes misread the fact that there's a range, and there's of course there are things that are inappropriate in small talk, like it's not a limitless range, but there's a range of ways to be effective and successful at small talk. And what you want to do over time is you want to try to find your way that fits within that range. It's sort of like, I mean, maybe you could use the analogy, if you like cooking, of creating, fusion food. Like, you're blending your personality and culture alongside these new rules, right? And in a fusion chef doesn't just throw together ingredients, try it and it's like tastes great. Usually you have to experiment and try a few things and see if it works, and also see how it feels. So you're simultaneously looking outward and inward. Outward to see if it achieves the effect that you're looking for, and inward in terms of how it feels, in terms of, is this work for me? Do I feel authentic enough doing this? Do I feel super, like, do I feel embarrassed and inauthentic? Well, maybe that's not the angle on small talk that you want to take. And so I think by trial and error, and also working with someone, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a coach or whatever, I think that can be really valuable too. I see we're running out of time.
We are running out of time, and so I'm going to, on behalf of Andy and myself, say first thanks to all of the audience, all the fantastic Brown alum who participated. Thank you so much for your comments, your questions, your experiences. Thanks so much to the Global Alumni team, to Alexia, to Joanna, to Crystal, and others for inviting us to participate in this. Andy, thank you for the great work that you're doing. It's incredibly helpful. It's been super helpful in my life and my career. One of the things and themes that you talk about, Andy, is saying that curiosity is one of the most important ingredients in cross-cultural relationships. So I'll just sort of end by suggesting take Andy's advice and stay curious, everyone. And hope to see you back in a similar forum soon.
And thank you very much. If anyone wants to follow up with anything, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to, continue the conversation.